Hey, we're back for the second installment, which is actually like the fifth installment. It's not important. In any case, what's important is I'm apparently not very good with numbers, but I do have another video now about the founding of the Federal Reserve. So we left off with the last video, a collection of the richest, most powerful bankers in the country, and a senator known for being deeply involved in the financial industry, hole up for a week on their own private island paradise, having arrived at Hoboken in disguise. And don't forget that these guys were told to show up dressed like duck hunters. They were told to only use their first names, never be seen together, act like they didn't know each other, and avoid newspaper reporters at all cost. Some of them even used fake names, like code names. This is how concerned they were that somebody in the American public might find out what they're doing. Which definitely all sounds on the up and up, right? And by the way, the train that they board, yeah, it's a secret one owned by Nelson W. Aldrich, the congressman that we talked about in the last video. They journey on that thing about 1,000 miles before they hop on a private chartered ferry in Brunswick, Georgia, and head over to Jekyll Island just off the coast for the next 9 days. Again, in secret, at an otherwise completely deserted resort, 9 days over Thanksgiving in 1910. And once there, they debate, they argue, they presumably hunt sharecroppers for sport. Now, Jekyll Island counts among its benefactors both J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller, along with a small group of other millionaires. Just for a little more perspective, they own the thing, it's a private club, and it's generally where their families go on vacation. Yes, we wouldn't want to have to vacay among all of the peasantry and the scum. Actually, you know what's really cool is that the Jekyll Island Club is still there, by the way. It's now a state park for the state of Georgia, but the clubhouse has been fully restored, and you can totally now visit it. If you go in, there is even, once you go down a hallway, a little plaque that says, in this room, the Federal Reserve was created by a door. Which I've always thought was interesting, because like, these guys didn't talk about any of this and, like, flat out denied that any of it happened until the mid-1930s. Which, again, points to just how on the up and up all of this was. But who were these guys, right? They're all showing up in secret. Well, let's talk about it. The first guy that we'll talk about is going to be Apia Andrew Jr., generally known as Apia Andrew for some reason. I don't know why that's better. But he's a former professor of economics from Harvard. He'd taken leave to spend a couple of years studying the central banks of Europe up until 1909. At the time that he was on Jekyll Island, he had just left his job as director of the U.S. Mint for his new posting as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Pomeroy Davison Sr. This guy pretty much only wound up where he was because of pure nepotism. He started out as a bookkeeper at a bank that was managed by one of his own relatives. Then he gets a job by the age of 21 at another bank that his wife was connected with. He'd been president of the Liberty National Bank and helped found the Bankers Trust Company. At the time of the Jekyll Island meeting, he's a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, who also have Bankers Trust. That name, J.P. Morgan, might sound familiar from my first video. And if you haven't watched that one, maybe go back and watch that one. Come back here. I'll wait. Anyway, the next one we have is Frank Arthur Vanderlip Sr. Now, Vanderlip is kind of an interesting guy. He had been a financial journalist for the Chicago Tribune before he was spotted by Lyman Gage, who was McKinley's Secretary of the Treasury, while at an extension course for political economics at the University of Chicago. Gage then makes Vanderlip his personal secretary for all of like 6 whole weeks before he promotes him to Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. While in that position, he again catches the attention of somebody important, a personal friend of William Rockefeller, J.J. Stillman. And Stillman was the president of what was the largest bank in the country at the time, the National City Bank of New York. And if you've never heard of that, that's because it's now known as just Citi, C-I-T-I Bank. So while there in 1908, he helped create the close banking ties between the United States and the Empire of Japan, along with Barons Shibusawa Aichi, Takamine Mitsue, and some others. By the time we get to Jekyll Island, he's now the president of the National City Bank of New York. And now we come to one of our principal villains of the story, Paul Moritz Warburg. Warburg is born into the generational German-Jewish banking family that runs M.M. Warburg and Company. They have origins going back to the Medici in Venice. His wife, Nina Loeb, is the daughter of Solomon Loeb, the founder of the New York investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Oh yeah, he was the personal representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and also one of the richest men in the world at the time. But so in 1902, Warburg leaves Europe and comes to New York to head up the New York branch of Kuhn, Loeb and Company there. And while he's there, he writes an article titled Defects and Needs of Our Banking System, essentially advocating the need for a European-style central banking system in the United States. What a shock that the guy who grew up as part of the central banking system in Europe would advocate for that here. However, because Warburg is so self-conscious about his broken English that he kind of speaks and writes in, he basically leaves that sitting on his desk until 1906. It's that point when a professor at Columbia University convinced him to go ahead and publish it in the New York Times. He'd ultimately publish a whole bunch more papers extolling the virtues of a central banking system and spoke numerous times at Columbia on the subject as well. This, of course, led to him being interviewed by Aldrich's National Monetary Commission in 1908. Also, speaking of familiar ties, his brother Max ran the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands, and his brother Felix was married to the daughter of Jacob Schiff, who would succeed him at Wells Fargo after his appointment to the board of the Federal Reserve. During Jekyll Island, Warburg is currently on the board of directors at Wells Fargo, having been voted into that position back in February. There was also Charles Norton there. He had been a trustee of Lake Forest University and chairs of both the development commissions for the Chicago Merchants and Chicago Commercial Clubs. He'd also been President Taft's private secretary, and he was president of the First National Bank of New York, second in size only to the National City Bank when he got invited to Jekyll Island. There was also Benjamin Strong Jr. Strong had started out as a clerk at a Wall Street investment firm that was kind of closely associated with his father's employer after not going to college because he decided he needed to work, something with family finances and his older brother having gone. Anyway, he would move on to join J.P. Morgan, the Bankers Trust. During the panic in 1907, he worked pretty closely with J.P. Morgan himself to shut down the run on the banks. At the time of Jekyll Island, he is the vice president of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company and would go on to be the first head of the Federal Reserve. And all of this, again, with a high school education. Lastly, we come to Nelson Aldrich himself, our other personal villain, and his personal secretary, Arthur Shelton, but we don't know a whole lot about Shelton. He was a congressional secretary of the National Monetary Commission. That's kind of all we know. I mean, well, at least that's all I know. But Aldrich. Oh, let me tell you about Aldrich. Nelson W. Aldrich, as I mentioned last video, is the guy who, with a light assist from J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller, put this little shindig of skullduggery together. He's a Republican senator from Rhode Island, actually one of the longest sitting senators from Rhode Island ever, and was known as one of the Big Four, along with Orville H. Platt, William B. Ellison, and John Colt Spooner. They pretty much controlled any major decisions in the Senate in the first decade of the 20th century. His long tenure in the Senate, by the way, is probably thanks to Rhode Island having restricted senators to being only natural-born property owners, who were also willing to pay a poll tax. And after that got repealed, just so much gerrymandering. Aldrich is a hell of a guy. He had co-sponsored the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, which not only dramatically raised the cost of goods coming to the United States at rates specifically requested by his bosom buddy Theodore Havmeyer in the just dystopian cartel, the Sugar Trust. But that bill also created the first income tax in the United States, the corporate income tax. Oh, and, you know, he, of course, would go on 3 years later to literally introduce the 16th Amendment. This guy had also spearheaded the Aldrich-Vreeland Act 2 years prior to Jekyll Island, which established that whole National Monetary Commission thing that you keep hearing about in these videos. And hilariously, that was intended to break up what they called the Money Trust. Basically an organization of all of the richest people and richest bankers in the country that everybody pretty much hated, and with good cause. Which is, you know, ironic considering, again, Aldrich is literally one of the money trust guys. Anyway, so the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, also known as the National Bank Circulation Act, is inextricably linked to the Federal Reserve. It basically allowed banks under certain conditions to issue what they called emergency currency, backed not by gold through government bonds, but simply by securities the banks themselves held, making it, if you're keeping score, the first bill to authorize fiat currency in the United States. Oh, and fun fact, this act arguably would be instrumental in helping Woodrow Wilson push the United States into the First World War. I mean, you know, he did help electrify the street trolleys across Rhode Island using a electric street trolley company he had a controlling interest in. But, you know, he sold all of those shares in 1906 to Charles Singer Mellon, the big-time Wall Street personal banker for J.P. Morgan. And hey, as long as we're talking about evil men, Aldrich's daughter, yeah, she married John Davison Rockefeller Jr., the son of John Davison Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil. And guess what? They had a kid, Aldrich's grandchild. You know what they named their kid? Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Yep. The A in Nelson A. Rockefeller, Aldrich. Ain't that sweet? Aldrich is a pillar of the progressive movement who thought government should get its grubby little paws into absolutely everything. Or rather, that his money-hungry Wall Street buddies should be able to get their grubby little hands into everything via government protectionism. And again, this guy always ran as the anti-money trust guy, right? Because if you were a pro-money trust, no one was going to vote for you in the early 20th century in the United States. Which might seem super ironic, because he was literally part of that club. But it shouldn't be surprising, because Woodrow Wilson also ran on the same kind of promise, despite being hand-picked by the money trust, financed almost entirely by them, and perpetually surrounded by nothing but money trust cronies. You'll recognize Woodrow Wilson as the guy who helped champion the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, and also got America into World War I. But there's your rogues gallery. You have a collection of people who are all some of the worst, money-grubbing, horrible people you can possibly imagine at the beginning of the 20th century. And they have met in secret on Jekyll Island to talk about how to how to secure the financial well-being of the economy.